She didn't wait for dessert. She didn't wait for the music to finish either. "Still just an employee, Emma?" Claire said into the microphone. "Some people are born leaders. Some just work for them." The words carried easily across the vineyard, clear as glass. Laughter followed. Not loud. Not cruel enough to object to. The acceptable kind. My mother clapped first. I felt it before I saw it. That small shift in the air when people decide it's safe to laugh. I was already smiling by the time anyone looked my way. It was an outdoor wedding in Napa Valley. Late afternoon light sliding down the hills, turning the vines a deep, expensive green. White linen stretched tight across round tables, corners snapping in the breeze. A jazz trio had been hired to sound like background. Bottles of Cabernet sat in silver buckets, each tagged at $120. Several guests made sure to say the price out loud. I had arrived alone, parked at the far end of the gravel lot, dust still clinging to my shoes. They placed me with people who asked what I did and nodded before I finished answering. A zoning attorney, 2 developers, a restaurant investor who spoke softly and never used verbs. Claire moved through the tables like she owned the space between them. Jason followed close, one hand steady at her back, smiling the practiced smile of a man who knew his debt but not his balance. My parents stayed near her, watching her face, waiting for cues. They didn't look at me. When Claire spoke, she tilted her head just enough that her shadow fell across my table. Her veil caught the light. I noticed a loose thread near the hem of her dress and wondered who would be blamed for it later. I didn't lower my eyes. I slid my chair back an inch, smoothed the front of my jacket, and straightened my spine. The glass in my hand was sweating, cold against my palm. I set it down carefully so it wouldn't shake. I didn't answer her. I watched condensation pool on the linen. I counted the soft thump of the bass as the band came back in, right on cue. Inside, something closed. Not anger, not hurt. More like a latch finding its place. Applause rolled through the vineyard. Claire lifted her glass. Jason kissed her cheek. And while everyone was still looking at them, I reached into my bag and touched the edge of the envelope I hadn't planned to open today. The one thing at that table that didn't belong to her at all. I left my hand there on the envelope for a moment longer than necessary, just long enough to remind myself it was real. The paper was thick, the kind that doesn't bend easily, edges clean, weight familiar. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Some things do their work simply by existing. People drifted back to their conversations. Wine was poured. Someone joked about traffic on Highway 29. The band slid into another careful tune. If you didn't know what to listen for, it all sounded normal again. That's how these things usually go. A public remark, a polite laugh, and then everyone agrees, without saying it, that the moment has passed. I stayed seated, shoulders relaxed, eyes level. I've learned that stillness unsettles people more than words ever do. They knew my title, or at least the one that fit neatly on a LinkedIn line: operations consultant, project-based, employee. It's amazing how far people will go with so little information. No one had ever asked what I signed or for whom. No one had asked whose calls I returned first or which rooms I was allowed into without knocking. Those questions require curiosity. My family never had much of that when it came to me. I excused myself and walked toward the edge of the vineyard, heels sinking slightly into the dirt. The air smelled like crushed leaves and oak from the barrels nearby. I could hear Claire's laugh behind me, bright, practiced, pitched just high enough to carry. Jason was explaining something to a man in a blue blazer, hands moving too fast, the way people gesture when they're trying to outrun the numbers in their head. I watched him for a second longer than I meant to. A year earlier, I had signed the final papers that made me a silent managing partner in a logistics investment fund most people had never heard of and didn't need to. $48.6 million in revenue the previous year. Quiet money. Disciplined money. The kind that doesn't announce itself at weddings. My name wasn't on the website. It wasn't meant to be. My percentage, 12%, sat in a trust structure designed to keep it boring and invisible. It worked. What Jason didn't know, what Claire didn't know, what my parents certainly didn't know, was that the fund had taken a position in the restructuring of his restaurant group 6 months ago. Not out of sentiment, out of math. Labor costs, supply chain failures, too many leases signed during a good year that never came back. He'd called it a strategic partnership at dinner once, proud of the phrase. I'd nodded, asked him to pass the salt. The loan he was counting on, the one keeping his doors open through the next quarter, required a single signature for final approval. Mine. I leaned against a post at the edge of the property and watched the sun drop lower, light thinning, shadows stretching between the vines. There was a time when I would have rehearsed speeches in moments like this. Sharp lines, clean endings. Age cures you of that habit. Now I let the facts sit where they were. They didn't need me to defend them. Back at the tables, my mother was telling someone how proud she was of Claire. My father laughed a little too loudly at something Jason said. No one looked for me. That was fine. They saw what they wanted to see. An employee, alone, properly placed. They didn't know who I was, and I had no reason at all to tell them. By the time the sun slipped behind the hills, the vineyard took on that softer light people mistake for forgiveness. Strings of bulbs blinked on, one by one, and the place looked gentler than it had any right to. I walked back toward the table slowly, the way you do when you're deciding whether to rejoin a conversation or let it collapse without you. My chair was still where I'd left it, nudged back slightly, waiting. Nothing had shifted. That, too, told me enough. 6 months before the wedding, I'd been sitting at my kitchen table with a mug that had gone cold, scrolling through documents Jason didn't know I had access to yet. It started the way these things usually do, with a number that didn't quite behave. A revenue line that stayed smooth during a quarter when everyone else was coughing. I pulled the thread. The fabric came apart faster than I expected. $2.3 million. That was the loan. Venture capital, short runway, high confidence, all wrapped in language meant to sound visionary instead of desperate. 3 restaurants pledged as collateral, each one already carrying its own quiet problems. Equipment leases stacked on top of rent, suppliers being paid later than promised. None of that was fatal on its own. What caught my eye was the cash flow report. It had been adjusted, not dramatically, just enough to make the margins look obedient, the kind of adjustment people convince themselves doesn't count. I remember leaning back in my chair and listening to the refrigerator hum. There's a particular sound appliances make late at night, a low, patient whine. It felt appropriate. I didn't feel shocked. I felt confirmed. That's different. Shock asks something of you. Confirmation just asks what you're going to do with it. Claire's name appeared next, tucked neatly into the guarantees. Personal guarantee, jointly executed. She'd signed it with the same confidence she signs birthday cards. Fast, trusting, assuming the sentiment mattered more than the text. She hadn't read the attachment. Most people don't. Clause 17.3 sat there like a joke that only lawyers laugh at. Spouse assumes all contingent liabilities upon marriage. Clean sentence. No drama, no raised voice, just a quiet transfer of gravity. I closed the file and stared at my reflection in the darkened screen. There was a version of me, years ago, who would have driven straight to my parents' house with a folder under my arm, who would have tried to explain, who would have believed that information, delivered clearly, could change the way people behave. That version had retired. Instead, I sent 3 emails. One to an M&A attorney I trusted, subject line plain, no punctuation. One to an independent auditor who didn't owe anyone a favor. And one to a tax advisor who had once worked for the IRS and still spoke about it the way people talk about the weather, factually, without nostalgia. I didn't write much in any of them. I attached documents. I asked questions that could be answered with evidence. Then I waited. Back at the wedding, someone asked if I wanted another drink. I shook my head and thanked them. My hands were steady. Across the table, Jason was laughing again, louder now, shoulders loose, the posture of a man who believed the worst part was behind him. Claire leaned into him, her ring catching the light. I noticed how often she touched it, as if to reassure herself it was still there. I thought about the auditor's first reply, how quick it had been. We'll need to restate several quarters. I thought about the attorney's note, brief and careful, outlining scenarios without adjectives. I thought about the last email, the one that ended with, "You may want to be patient." Patience is easier when you're not in a hurry to be understood. The band struck up something slower. People drifted toward the dance floor. My parents stood, arms around each other, watching Claire sway in her dress, faces soft with pride. I stayed seated, fingertips resting on the table's edge, feeling the grain beneath the linen. The castle around them looked solid enough in the evening light. Music, laughter, promises stacked high. Sandcastles always do, right up until the tide decides to come in. The tide didn't rush in all at once. It never does. It waited. And so did I. After that night, I leaned into the role everyone was already comfortable assigning me. The younger sister who never quite caught up. The one with interesting work and no titles worth remembering. I showed up when expected, I left early, I nodded at advice I hadn't asked for. When Claire talked about centerpieces or seating charts, I listened like it mattered to me. When Jason mentioned expansion plans, I smiled and said things like, "Sounds ambitious," the way people do when they don't intend to be part of the outcome. There's a freedom in being underestimated. You stop having to manage expectations and start managing time. Behind the scenes, I set up what I privately called the war room, though it lived mostly in shared folders and late-night calls. One financial attorney who understood leverage the way farmers understand weather. One forensic accountant who liked quiet puzzles and hated shortcuts. We didn't meet in person. We didn't need to. The documents spoke clearly enough on their own. We started with the debt, not the headline numbers, the small ones people forget to respect. Vendor balances rolled forward too many months. Equipment leases refinanced without addressing depreciation. A line of credit renewed on optimism instead of cash. Patterns emerged. They always do. We mapped them out on a timeline, not to dramatize them, but to see where pressure would land first. Next came the tax calendar. Nothing theatrical, just dates, filing windows, review periods, the kind of schedule no one pays attention to until it's suddenly very important. The forensic accountant flagged inconsistencies that didn't rise to scandal, but invited questions. Questions invite letters. Letters invite delays. Delays invite scrutiny. It's a chain reaction, and once it starts, it doesn't care about weddings. The bank correspondence was last, carefully worded, polite, conditional. A reminder of covenants. A request for updated disclosures. Nothing that would cause panic, yet. The goal wasn't to push. It was to let gravity do its work. Through all of it, I kept my voice even. With my parents, I was supportive. With Claire, I was affectionate in the way siblings can be when there's nothing left to compete over. She talked about the venue deposit like it was a victory. Jason complained about staffing shortages like they were temporary weather. I never corrected them. Correction implies urgency. I had none. There was a moment, a few weeks before the wedding, when Claire asked me outright if I thought she was making a mistake. We were standing in her kitchen, boxes stacked along the wall, invitation samples spread across the counter. I took a second before answering, long enough to feel the cool edge of the granite under my fingertips. "I think you know what you want," I said. It wasn't encouragement. It wasn't warning. It was a mirror. She smiled, relieved, and went back to her seating chart. People like to believe winning is loud, that it announces itself. The truth is, the long game is quiet by necessity. You don't argue. You don't threaten. You don't rush to be understood. You let people move forward unguarded, convinced they've already crossed the finish line. By the time the wedding day arrived, everything was in motion. Not visibly, not to the guests sipping expensive wine under string lights, but the filings were queued, the reviews scheduled, the signatures waiting. Claire and Jason stepped into that vineyard, believing they'd beaten the odds. Love, business, family, all tied up neatly with a bow. I watched them dance, watched my parents beam, watched the night settle into something almost tender. I stayed in my seat, hands folded, breathing slow. There's a particular calm that comes from knowing you don't have to do anything else. All you have to do is let the game play out. The game didn't end at the wedding. It paused, the way storms do when people mistake clear skies for safety. The reception stretched late into the night, and by the time the last plates were cleared, the mood had softened into that loose, celebratory haze where confidence grows louder than caution. Claire made her rounds with her left hand angled just right, letting the diamond catch the light. $80,000, she told anyone who lingered long enough to admire it. She said the number the way people say a punchline, waiting for the reaction, enjoying it when it landed. I congratulated her, touched her arm lightly, careful not to smudge anything. She smelled like champagne and peonies. Jason drank as if the night required it. Red wine first, then bourbon someone had brought out from a car as the band packed up. His laugh carried farther than it needed to. At one point, near the bar, he raised his glass and said, "We made it. Nobody can touch us now." A few people cheered. Someone slapped him on the back. I watched the way his balance shifted just a little afterward, the way his confidence leaned forward before the rest of him caught up. I left before midnight. I always do. There's nothing to be gained from watching people celebrate a future you already know the shape of. The next morning, my phone buzzed with photos. Claire and Jason barefoot by the pool, robes tied loosely, sunlight sharp and forgiving. The caption read, "Worth it." I double-tapped and set the phone down. The paperwork came later that week. Not dramatic, not urgent, framed as housekeeping, the kind of thing married couples do when they're getting organized. A post-nuptial addendum, presented as routine, aligned with the restructuring agreements Jason had already half explained to Claire months earlier. He told her it was standard. He told her it was protection. He told her it meant they were thinking long-term. None of those statements were technically lies. They were just incomplete. Claire called me that afternoon, voice bright, a little rushed. She said Jason wanted another set of eyes on the documents, said I was good with details. I could hear him in the background, pacing, the low murmur of someone already convinced the hard part was over. I agreed to come by. They were still living out of boxes, the house echoing in places that hadn't learned its rhythms yet. Papers were spread across the dining table, corners aligned with care. Jason stood when I walked in, shook my hand like we were closing a deal instead of a marriage. Claire hovered near the counter, scrolling through her phone, trusting the process the way people trust weather apps. I skimmed the pages slowly, not because I needed to understand them, I already did, but because speed raises suspicion. Clause placement matters. Tone matters. I pointed out nothing. I corrected nothing. I handed the pen to Claire and said, "Just sign where it's highlighted." She hesitated for half a second. Not doubt, habit. Then she signed. Jason followed, barely looking down, already talking about dinner reservations. I capped the pen and slid it back across the table. No one thanked me. That was fine. Afterward, Claire showed me the ring again, twisting it slightly, admiring how it sat. Jason poured another drink and leaned against the counter, relaxed, victorious. He talked about expansion, about new locations, about how the stress was finally behind them. I nodded, offered a smile that didn't require maintenance. Driving home, I noticed how quiet the roads were, how clean the lines looked under the streetlights. There's a moment after a decision is made, after ink dries, when everything feels lighter. That's the illusion. It's convincing. It's also temporary. A few days later, Jason sent a group message celebrating a new financing milestone. Champagne emojis, fireworks. Claire replied with hearts. My parents chimed in with congratulations, pride thick in every word. I read it all and set the phone down without responding. Silence, at that point, felt appropriate. False victories are generous that way. They give you time. They let people settle into belief, rearrange their lives around it. They make the eventual correction sharper by contrast. By then, the calendar was already moving. Review dates approaching, letters drafted but not sent, files resting in folders with neutral names. I went to work. I did my grocery shopping. I folded laundry. Life kept its shape, and somewhere beneath all of it, the ink dried completely. By the third week after the wedding, the champagne glow had thinned into something more practical. That's usually how it goes. Celebration burns fast. Reality takes its time. They threw a party to mark the opening of the fourth restaurant, a soft launch dressed up as a victory lap. Early evening, reclaimed wood tables, Edison bulbs strung low enough to flatter everyone. The place smelled like new paint and seared meat. Claire arrived first, dressed sharp, posture sharper, the ring flashing every time she lifted her glass. Jason followed 10 minutes later, already flushed, already loud. He hugged people too tightly, laughed a little too hard. Success does that to men who aren't used to carrying it. I stood near the back, close enough to hear, far enough not to be included. Old habit. The crowd was a mix of investors, city officials, a few friends who liked to say they'd believed from the start. Someone tapped a spoon against a glass. Jason raised his hands for quiet, grinning. That's when the door opened. It wasn't dramatic. No pause, no music cutting out, just a man in a gray suit stepping inside, followed by another who didn't bother to smile. They moved with the calm of people who don't need permission. One of them asked for Jason by name. Not loudly, precisely. The room shifted. You can feel it when confidence loses its footing. Jason blinked, once, then twice, as if the lights had gone up too fast. He made a joke, something about surprises, about paperwork. It didn't land. The lawyer introduced himself, handed over a folder. At the same time, phones began to buzz, one by one, a ripple of vibration moving through pockets and purses. The IRS notices had gone out that afternoon. Audit letters, clean envelopes, neutral language, the kind that doesn't accuse, only asks. The bank followed an hour later. Accounts frozen pending review. Not closed, just paused. There's a difference. One invites panic, the other invites dread. Claire's smile held for a few seconds longer than it should have. Then it faltered. She looked at Jason, waiting for him to explain. He didn't. He was already backing away, voice low, telling the lawyer they could talk outside. The lawyer didn't move. Someone spilled a drink, glass shattered. The sound cut through the room like a line drawn in chalk. It unraveled quickly after that. Faster than people expect, slower than movies promise. The lawyer spoke quietly to Claire now, pointing to a section in the folder. She read, lips moving without sound. I watched her hand go to her ring, twist it once, then still. $3.1 million. That was the number. Total exposure, personal liability, fully assumed. Jason's phone rang. He stepped away to take it. Didn't come back. Later, we learned he'd driven straight through the night. Nevada first. Different laws, different clocks. He left behind a jacket, a laptop, and a voicemail that didn't apologize so much as explain. Claire listened to it once. She didn't play it again. The party dissolved into clusters of murmured conversations. People gathered coats they hadn't planned to put back on yet. Someone asked if the kitchen was still open. No one answered. Claire stood very still in the center of it all, like the eye of something that had just decided where to land. She found me without looking for me. Her voice shook when she spoke, not loud, barely there. You knew? I thought about lying. It would have been easy, kind even. But kindness has its seasons. This wasn't one of them. You asked if I was just an employee, I said. That was it. No lecture, no list, no victory speech. Her face changed, not in anger, but in understanding. It's a specific look. You see it when someone realizes the ground has rules they never bothered to learn. My parents arrived late, breathless, confused. They looked from Claire to me, searching for an explanation that would let them keep their map of the world intact. I didn't offer one. Explanations feel indulgent when the facts are already speaking. I left before the lawyers finished packing up. Outside the night was cool, quiet. The sign above the door glowed steadily, unaware of its own timing. I stood there for a moment, hands in my pockets, listening to the hum of traffic down the block. Masks don't fall off all at once. They slip. They crack. And then, suddenly, there's nothing left holding them in place. The weeks that followed didn't announce themselves as an ending. They arrived like mail you don't open right away, stacked quietly until the weight becomes noticeable. Claire's name started disappearing from places it used to live comfortably. Invitations stopped coming. Her profile photo went dark, then vanished altogether. The investigation moved forward at its own pace, methodical, incurious, immune to explanations that leaned on intention instead of evidence. 42 days after the opening party, the marriage ended the way it had begun, with paperwork, signatures, and a shared silence that did more talking than either of them could manage. Jason stayed gone. Nevada turned into somewhere else, somewhere harder to trace. I didn't attend any hearings. I wasn't called as a witness. My involvement was already complete by the time anyone thought to look for villains. There's a misconception that justice requires spectacle. Most of the time, it prefers paperwork and patience. My parents called more often during that stretch, voices careful, conversations circling the obvious without landing on it. They asked how I was sleeping, if work was busy, if I'd heard from Claire. I answered honestly and briefly. I didn't offer context. Context feels like persuasion, and I wasn't trying to persuade anyone of anything anymore. When the trust distribution came up, inevitable, awkward, I declined it. No drama, no statement, just the line item struck through. I'd already taken what I needed, when it was appropriate, and exactly according to the terms everyone had agreed to. Capital withdrawn on schedule. No acceleration, no penalty. Quiet exits are cleaner. There was no public reckoning, no victory lap, no satisfaction in watching people adjust their tone around me. That kind of thing ages you quickly. I let the story settle where it wanted to. Stories, like markets, correct themselves eventually. On a clear morning not long after, I stood in my office, glass walls, spare desk, nothing ornamental, and looked down at the Oakland harbor. Cranes moved slowly against the sky, lifting containers with the patience of practiced strength. The water was calm, slate-colored, dotted with whitecaps that didn't bother pretending to be anything else. I like places where work looks like work. My phone buzzed once on the desk. A message, plain text. Deal approved. No exclamation point, no congratulations, just confirmation. I adjusted my chair and leaned back, feeling the weight of it settle where it belonged. There was no need to smile this time. No one was watching. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the urge to explain who I was or what I did. The harbor kept moving. The work went on. That was enough.